Kia ora. Today I want to talk about the relationship between whiteness, colonialism, and knowledge production. Whiteness as a set of norms that are based upon white cultural values or values of white cultures uphold the supremacy of white people. In that sense, whiteness is integral to the project of racism. It upholds as normative, as universal, the specific particular values of white cultures. The colonial project is a project that is built upon whiteness. It devalues indigenous cultural forms. It devalues the cultures of colonized peoples in order to establish the supremacy of white culture, and this supremacy of white culture projected as civilization is the fundamental justification for the deployment of various forms of violence, all the way from rapes, murders to genocides that have been historically carried out on colonized peoples. White frameworks of articulating civilization then are inherently racist, but also are inherently violent in the sense that they legitimize forms of violence as civilizing tools. Now, this form of civilization works through the production of and setting up of whiteness as the universal structure for knowledge production, which at the same time devalues the knowledge produced by, held by the communities that are colonized by indigenous peoples. The projection of white civilization or the civilizational narrative where white cultural forms are projected as universal points of aspiration simultaneously then mark the indigenous culture, the colonized culture as the savage, as the native, as primitive, devoid of cognition, the ability to think, devoid of the capacity to produce and participate in the production of knowledge. So the devaluing of indigenous knowledge forms the infrastructure of whiteness. In the contemporary context, the architectures of science, the architectures of medicine constituted within the logics of whiteness then project science, medicine, engineering, technology as markers of progress, while simultaneously using these markers of progress to devalue indigenous cultures, the cultures of colonized peoples. So the cultures of colonized peoples projected as anti-science are then marked as the targets of civilizational forms of interventions. So the savage must be educated and trained in the architectures and methods of science for her and him to be civilized. Now, I will draw upon a couple of anecdotes to illustrate this. One of the earliest articles on the culture-centered approach that I published was a piece in Communication Theory in 2004 that discussed Santali theories of communication and health. Now, Santalis are an indigenous community that are indigenous to India and spread across various parts of eastern India. In my ethnographic work with Santalis, one of the most powerful lessons that I learned early on was the ways in which health is thought of as existing beyond the body of the individual and in the realm of the spirits and the trees. So health is connected to the spirits and is constituted within the context of trees, stones, nature, and the ecosystem. Now, I recall sharing this work in various white fora where whiteness dominates, and often being asked, you couldn't possibly believe this. So the lack of credibility of the Santali epistemology, the Santali way of knowing, is tied to what is seen as credible in the language of science, and specifically science that is immersed in whiteness, based upon an ontology that focuses on reductionism, and that works through reductionist principles. The notion that health can be connected to trees, to stones, to water, to the mountains, to nature, is seen as primitive. And the language of science within that context is used to perpetuate that violence, is used to devalue, in this case, Santali culture. More recently, I happened to host at CARE an activist in residence who talked about Maori ways of healing, Maori food systems and their connection to health and well-being, the relationship with, again, trees and nature, our conversations and dialogues with nature that are integral to our healing. The framing of indigenous knowledge as hocus pocus, the framing of indigenous knowledge as anti science, works to hold up white supremacy. That arrogance of whiteness, then, is integral and essential to perpetuating the forms of violence that we continue to witness today, in the form of capitalist expansions, in the form of neocolonial extractive projects that seek to occupy and steal indigenous land, indigenous spaces, forests and mountains where indigenous communities reside, often based upon the projection of science as a civilizational instrument. So, how do we then decolonize the conversation on science within this context? And I think the starting point about decolonizing science has to recognize the ways in which the language of science, the tools of science, have been integral to holding up white supremacy, to recognizing the ways in which science has been incorporated into logics of whiteness to perpetuate various forms of racism, and from that to actually work toward building registers that are based upon principles of dialogue, that are based upon principles of conversation, and that are based upon principles of listening to the voices of those communities, those cultures that have been historically erased. So when we consider, for instance, the problem of climate change, and this is a great example, and we hold up the project of science in the context of the problem of climate change, one of the things decolonizing approach teaches us is that the language of science and the tools of science have to be placed in conversation with the knowledge systems of indigenous communities, of indigenous cultures, who have often been the stewards of the environment, who have been the stewards of the climate, who have much to teach in terms of ways of protecting the environment, in terms of ways of living in harmony with land, with nature, and with our ecosystems. In that sense, then, the work of decolonizing science needs to, on one hand, acknowledge the epistemology of science as a way for crafting solutions, as a way for articulating solutions to challenges such as climate change, but at the same time has to open up the spaces for other forms of knowledge based upon alternative epistemologies that offer us registers for addressing the problem of climate change. So, in this short conversation, I hope to draw your attention to the question of whiteness and how it is intertwined with the production of knowledge, also with the devaluing of knowledge, with the project of violence, both on human lives, life forms, as well as on environment and our ecosystems, and then looking at possibilities of dismantling this white supremacy so that we can create openings for other ways of knowing that are vitally important today. Thank you.